take everything that I've learned, including all the mistakes I've made, and there's a bunch of those, and use that as an asset to design my own personal future so that I can create a greater impact in the world. And that's my challenge, right? And so I think that's going to be the challenge up until the last day.
Welcome to Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, the go-to podcast for financial advisors aiming to grow their assets under management, stand out in a crowded market, and retain assets nearly forever. Are you advising high net worth clients who own appreciated capital assets? Do you want to help them sell without losing a quarter, a third, or even more of their hard-earned profits to capital gains taxes? Then this podcast is tailored for you. Each episode brings you the latest strategies and expert advice from leading financial advisors, seasoned attorneys, and experienced CPAs. Learn how to maximize your clients' wealth, minimize their taxes, and supercharge your advisory practice with actionable insights. Join us on Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where you'll gain the knowledge and tools to set yourself apart and achieve unparalleled success in wealth management. Subscribe now and empower your practice for a brighter, more prosperous future. Welcome to Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets. I'm your host, Roger Silk, and our guest today is Stan Miller. Stan is the CEO and principal attorney at the Pinnacle Legacy Law Group in Little Rock, Arkansas. Stan has a deep passion for the transformative power of estate planning that he brings to helping his clients and their families secure their futures. Stan's known for his exceptional listening ability, and he works closely with clients to craft customized estate plans tailored to their unique and specific needs. Stan is also known for his ability to explain complicated ideas in simple language, and we're going to certainly ask him to do some of that today. And Stan ensures that every client fully understands the plan and the purpose to empower those clients with clarity and confidence. And Stan, that leads me right into a question, which is, that is a tall order. A lot of this stuff that you guys do is arcane, it's complex, it's known, really understood only by specialists. How do you go about making that stuff clear to people who haven't spent more of their lives than they should have dealing with that kind of stuff?
Well, Roger, first let me say that I appreciate the opportunity to be your guest today. It's an honor, a privilege, and I'm looking forward to our time together. I hope I can say some things that will be useful. To respond to that question, I will tell you, I don't think it's all that complicated. You know, I hear people tell me about how complicated it is, but actually, I don't think it really is that complicated. I think if you have somebody who doesn't understand it very well, they may want to make it sound complicated to make themselves look smart, but the truth is, it's just not that complicated.
For our guests who don't know you, which is probably a large fraction of them, can you give us a little background on how you got started and your journey to where you are now, the estate planning and other worlds that you may be involved in?
Okay. Yeah. So, I'll be brief. I was born and raised on a dairy farm. I grew up and realized I did not want to be a dairy farmer, even though my dad certainly created that opportunity for me. He was a little bit heartbroken whenever I declined. I told him that I didn't want to do that because I said, you can't ever go anywhere. He didn't, and he asked me, where would you want to go? My dad's attitude was, if you could be here on this farm, why would you want to be anywhere else? I went to college, then I went to Vanderbilt to law school, made the decision to come back to Arkansas, brought this gal with me who married me. She was a Vandy co-ed, and I practiced law for about 10 years, kind of general jack of all trades kinds of things. And I wasn't very happy about that. I decided, I really wanted to actually get good at something. And I made the decision to get good at estate planning. And it was a good decision. I remember exactly the moment I made the decision to do that. I had been talking to the guy I practiced law with at the time and telling him that I was thinking about doing this. And I'd done some reading up. This was early on in the transition away from will planning to living trust planning. Estate planning meant you went to the lawyer and got your will done. But somewhere in the 80s, there was a movement away from will planning because it mandated probate. And so it drove the transition from will planning to living trust planning. And I got on the bandwagon early on and became an advocate for this. What at that time was a new way of planning. It's not now. About 10 years into that, the living trust model won out. Nobody does wills anymore, or at least nobody does wills as a foundational estate plan. And so, but I sat down with my first client. Uh, my my the guy who was my law partner at the time brought the client in. It pre-quoted my fee for it, and brought the client in, and I still remember everything about that meeting to this day. I said, "Tell me about yourself." And she spent 2 hours telling me about herself. She told me about herself, about her husband, her late husband. She told me about her son and the issues she had had with him. So I listened to all this story and realized that I actually could bring a set of solutions to her that would address all those needs. And I kind of enjoyed that. It felt really good to be able to hear the need and be able to meet the need with solutions that I had and knew how to implement. That was really decisive for me. From that point forward, I told everybody, don't send me divorces or whatever. This is what I'm doing. And so I really focused on estate planning. And at that time, there were no resources available. There were no, communities or groups, or certainly this was pre-software. And so it was a pretty lonely world. And one thing led to another. And I ended up connecting up with a bunch of other guys around the country who felt equally lonely. And moving forward with the story, we ultimately ended up, 10 of us, forming a company called Wealth Counsel that became the leading provider of education and software to estate planning attorneys in the country. It was then and it still is. We grew it from my kitchen to 15,000 attorneys using the platform when we sold it back at the end of 2021. They've grown it since. And so we became the market leader, far and away the market leader in that niche of the world. We had about 80+% of the total market share for that. And so there's a huge network of attorneys around the country that are part of our community, used our software, attended our educational programs, came to meetings, became part of our community. And so as a result of that, I built a rather interesting network of relationships around the United States because of that. And today, still, most of my best friends are attorneys who are part of that community. And I continue now, even after we've sold it, I continue to maintain those relationships.
Wealth Counsel, you said, has about 15,000 members now?
Well, there were about 15,000 attorneys in the community. There were about 40, I think at the time we sold it, we had about 4,500 member law firms. But if you look at all the lawyers within those firms, there were about 15,000 attorneys who regularly use the Wealth Counsel software and access the educational content. I'm sure they've grown it since. I'm no longer involved with the company. Well, I mean, we're friends. I see them at meetings, but I don't get into the business of it. So I'm sure they've grown it.
Mm-hmm. Stan, you mentioned that your first estate planning client spoke for 2 hours.
Roger, it's been a while. I've slept since then, but it was a while. I didn't get in a hurry.
So yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is I'm sure since then you have kind of developed an approach to drawing out from people what you need to know and minimizing the embellishments that can make the meetings take longer than you have. Can you tell us a little bit about how you go about that?
So, yeah, in fact, I have a presentation I've developed on that. So I actually teach other people how to do that. But the the first thing I do is, and I'm talking now about an in-person meeting. A virtual meeting is a different story, but it just in a traditional in-person meeting environment, the first thing I do is I close the door and make sure that my staff knows to not interrupt me unless there's a fire in the building. And then what I do is very intentionally create a state of rapport with this client by positioning the way I sit so that I'm in just the right proximity to them. I want to have eye contact with them so that my eyes are on the same plane as theirs. I want to be breathing at the same rate. And then I want to take control of the meeting and always keep control of the meeting. And I do that by using my agenda. I don't use a printed agenda, but I have an agenda. And my first question always has to do with essentially, it's the first question I asked him in that first meeting I had, which was, tell me about yourself. And if I get blank looks about like what not to say, what am I supposed to say? My next question is, well, tell me the interesting stuff. I want to hear the interesting parts, right? And what will happen sometimes is we'll have a very type A business executive who brought his financial statement and he wants to push that across the table and talk about that. And I just gently push that away and tell him we'll get to that because what I want to find out is his story first. I want to find out how you met this lady that you're here with, that you're married to. Tell me that story. I want to hear that. And what I found is that after a couple of attempts, nobody ever pushes back on that. And then what I hear is I hear them tell me about themselves. So after I've mined through that, then my next question is tell me about your children. And I get them to do that two times. So the first time they tell me about their children, I'm usually making notes on art paper, right? And so I'm drawing a diagram. They tell me about the oldest and the next oldest and down, starting with the oldest to youngest. And they tell me their names and I learn that. And I want to find out if they're married or not, if they have health issues, whatever. But my clients at that initial meeting tell me about their children. I get the press conference version. It's all airbrushed and sanitized. So I don't really get what I need that way. So I have to get them to talk about the kids the second time. And the way I do that is once I have them all sketched out on my art pad, my next question is, well, tell me of all these kids, tell me which one would you say does the best job managing the money they make? And then I get to watch the clients look at each other and debate that. Sometimes the answer is instant and immediate. Sometimes they have to talk about it, right? But once I learn which one of the children does the best job managing the money they make, then I know which ones are not the best, right? And so that opens the door to other questions about stability of marriages, about spending patterns. And at that point, the door really does open up. And that's when I began to glean the information I really need to do the real planning work. This is when I get the real stories about the kids, about the relationship dynamics, about maybe the daughter's husband, and that he doesn't get along with other family members, or I find out that I've got a son-in-law that would love to spend money on bass boats or whatever. Uh, I find out who has real day jobs and who's supporting whom. So a real picture of the dynamics of these relationships, both in terms of human relationships, but also things around work ethic, addictive behavior patterns, all of those things, all of which are things I really need to know to be able to do proper planning. So then I hear about the kids. I also learn about parents. That's my next question, because one thing I've learned, I'll tell you, I always ask about parents. No matter how old my client is, I had a client one time that I did an estate plan for who was 89 years old. She came in to sign the plan. And in the course of the signing, she looked at me and said, let's speed this up. I need to get home and take care of my mother.
Not something you
And
hear every day from an 89-year-old.
that's right. And since then, I have always asked about parents, because it turns out that our clients sometimes are the sole source of support for aging parents, particularly if they're really old, like in this case, right? And so if my client died before the parent, which can happen, then that parent is in a pretty bad place. I need to anticipate that possibility and build in a solution to that in the plan just in case. So another question I've learned to ask, I did not do this initially when I had married couples. For years, I didn't ask this question, but one day I got around to doing my own estate plan. And I thought, I'm the lawyer. I know what I'm doing. I'll do all this. So I called my wife and said, honey, come on down to the office. I've got notaries and witnesses here. We need to get this signed. So she came to the office and came into the conference room. I had it all laid out for her to sign. And we hadn't really talked about it. It was just, trust me, I'm your husband. I'll do this right. And my wife didn't pick up the pen immediately. She leaned forward and said something that completely shocked me. She said, well, before I sign this, I want to be really sure that if I die before you, some 27-year-old Southwest flight attendant's not going to get my kids' money. And I swear, Roger, this had never come up in any conversation we'd ever had. I sat there for 30 seconds, completely stunned. As she said this, I was initially annoyed. And then after about 30 seconds, pivoted and was about, well, I should be flattered that she thinks there's some risk of this, right? So what I realized is that one of the unspoken anxieties that in estate planning with married couples is a fear of what happens with the next spouse that rarely is discussed, because it's an uncomfortable conversation. But it's an issue of particular concern for women, because women figure they're probably going to outlive their husband. But if they don't, and actuarially, the insurance companies will tell you that, us guys are in most cases going to pass away first. In those relatively small percentage of the cases where that's not the case, and the husband is the survivor, there's a lot of data about that. Most people, that anybody listening to this podcast knows, particularly if even more so, I would say among people that go to church on Sunday, is everybody knows the story about the guy at church that he lost his wife, and in 6 months he was married to a gold digger and she got all the money. This happens a lot. And so it's women I found that are really concerned about the issue much more so than men are. And so I learned my lesson, and I will tell you, I do not believe that I've done an estate planning interview with a married couple since that signing meeting with my wife when I have not asked a question. And the way I ask the question is, I don't ask the question exactly. What I do is I tell the story I just told you about my wife, because my goal in working with this client is to make it safe for them to tell me that they're worried about this issue. I don't want them to go home and get in an argument about this. I want to create a safe zone where the one of them, whichever one it is, can lean forward and say, well, I am kind of worried about that. And I want them to feel like that they're in good company. There are a lot of other people, including my wife, who had that concern. And so we talk about that. And I will say that after having that conversation, we end up actually doing specific planning about 40, 50% of the time to deal with that issue specifically, we'll create features in the estate plan that provide the husband's portion of the estate rather than passing outright with no strings to his wife. We'll pass instead to a trust that's protected so that if the wife gets married again, the new husband has no legal right to that. And sometimes we'll have a co-trustee as trustee of that, as a co-trustee of that trust. It could be an adult child that they trust to be the trustee or the co-trustee with his mother. But by having that adult as the co-trustee of, let's say, if I die first, my portion of the estate would go into a trust for my wife, and my son would be a trustee or co-trustee of that, so that if my wife is swooned by this guy who has a great idea for a restaurant, he's always wanted to open but never had the money. Now the money is here, right? At least the portion of the estate that we agreed was mine, that's in a lockbox, behind a combination lock, and my son's got to agree to that investment before they make it. Now her portion is hers, and she can do unwise things with that, but the portion passing from me is going to go into a separate container that's protected from that. And ultimately, when my wife passes, those funds are going to pass on down to the next generation. There are different combinations of that, but something on that order we do about roughly half the time. And I will say that the wealthier the clients are, the more frequent that is. So if we have a client with 8 or 10 million or 12 million or more in net worth, I would say that that's pretty standard feature of the estate plan, right? So that's the whole part of the conversation about how do you protect our wealth from the surviving spouse's next spouse. And I think that's an issue that's not explored very often because clients don't bring it up with us. We have to tease it out of them because they've never talked about it themselves. It's really rare I've seen anybody who's discussed this, and it's uncomfortable. And so they don't bring it up. And unless I bring it up, I'm not going to hear about it. So we talk about that. And then I don't get into discussion about taxes until I've learned about them, the kids, the grandkids, the parents. I want to know the human story first, and then I want to find out about assets. And then when I've learned about assets, I learn things like, do we have an asset that we have a real emotional connection to? Is it something more than just a financial asset? Is it a homestead that's been in the family for 150 years and we want to preserve it because of its unique, that unique aspect of it? Or is that just a fungible financial asset that we can sell and turn into cash? We need to know that. And then once we know all that, then I can lean back in the chair and ask, what problems do I need to, what kind of protection do I need to make sure your family has? I want to make a list of the outcomes you want from this process. What outcomes do you want? And I want to hear them say the words to me that the things, I want them to list for me the things they want to accomplish. And usually the way I do that is to say, well, I have these meetings often and I hear people say, I'll make a list of the things I hear people say. And the list I recite to them are the things that I think are going to be the concerns for them based on what I've learned from that conversation. So what we do is we outline with clarity the outcomes they want. And they'll tell me, I want to stay out of court. I want to avoid probate. I want to eliminate all estate tax. And there are a few clients that are wealthy enough where that's a real issue. I want to have this second marriage protection, or I don't care about that. I'll give it all to my wife. I don't care what she does with it. I would say 95% of the time, parents will tell me, I want to make sure that the inheritance I'll leave my children is protected so that they will not lose it in a divorce, so that they will not lose it if they get sued or if they go bankrupt. And in a good number of cases, they will tell me, I want to protect it from their own lack of financial maturity, either because they're too young and just haven't developed the maturity yet, or because they're old enough to develop maturity and they haven't and probably never will. One thing I've learned in this business is that Once people get to be about 30, that's kind of how they're going to be. And if they're not financially responsible, if they're spendthrifts, can't manage money at age 30, that's how they're going to be at 60.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so we have to design a solution to address that. And so we talk through what those solutions are. And the solutions are all there. They're not even complicated.
Stan, what's your wheelhouse client? Where you guys are best able to be most helpful to? What kind of client?
It's not really net worth driven. We serve clients that have a high net worth, but we also serve clients that have a very low net worth because the issues there are different. You know, if you don't have a lot of money, the big concern is if I end up in a nursing home, how am I going to pay for it? And if you have a net worth of 500,000 or a million, or I want to say even 2 or 3 million, depending on where you live in the country, you know, the cost of being in a decent nursing home ranges at the low end from $6,000 or $7,000 a month up to, you know, a colleague of mine was telling me that on Long Island in New York, it's $18,000 or $20,000 a month for one person to be in a nursing home for 1 month. And so if you want to be able to pay for that with the income your investments generate, you can get out the calculator and back into what your net worth needs to be able to fund that out of income, right? I don't know what your number is, but I hear a lot of people talk about the 4% solution. I can take 4% of an asset bundle every year and spend that, and I can pretty much count on that asset base growing at a rate that will keep up with inflation. Well, if I'm spending $10,000 a month on nursing home care, you know, that's 120,000 a year. You divide that by 4%. I can't do that arithmetic in my head, but you know, that's a pretty big number. And that's just for one spouse, because even if the other spouse does not go to the nursing home, they've got to pay the light bill and put food on the table and make sure the grass gets cut at the house. So you got to fund that too. So you have to come in and do the arithmetic to determine, you know, is this nursing home risk a risk? And what I found is that for American couples who have a net worth of $3 million or less, it is a real threat. Sometimes they just close their eyes and avoid it, but there are all kinds of solutions. And so for those people, we do a certain kind of planning to protect them from that risk. If somebody comes in with $20 million, it's a different set of issues, right? Where we're having to think about the estate tax and other things. So we're solving for different problems. So it really does run the gamut of people that have not much all the way up to people that have, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Stan, are there some things that you wanted to talk about that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
Well, we'll say that one of my objectives, you know, one of my career goals personally going forward is to really expand the thinking around what constitutes really good estate planning so that it doesn't, it's not limited to who gets my property and how do they get it. I would like to expand the thinking around that. I would like for people to begin to think bigger than just that and see estate planning also as a conversation around how do I transfer my non-financial wealth, That, I mean, what I mean by that is values, family history and stories and traditions, things like work ethic, generosity. How do I embed those values into my children and my grandchildren so that after I'm gone, my legacy is not just the money they got, but it's the values they got from me. And I believe that financial advisors and estate planning attorneys can play a very proactive role in creating a roadmap with tools that can be implemented that really improves the likelihood of that really happening. We can't be responsible for all of it. I mean, your church or synagogue or mosque or whatever is going to play a role in that too. But there are things that we can do as planners, and I'm saying estate planning attorneys and financial advisors. There are things that we can do in our interactions with clients that provide the tools for them so they can connect with the next generations in a way that communicates these values in a compelling way and that results in a real transformation, sometimes in the quality of the relationship, but certainly it provides a much more satisfying outcome because, well, most people, whenever we die, we don't want to pay, we don't want to have the kids have to pay unnecessary taxes. We want to keep it out of court. We want to avoid the conflicts with them. But more than all of that, what we really want is to leave good kids and leave good grandkids. And I think that planners have the opportunity to do that. And that opportunity now is more awesome and more opportunistic than it's ever been. There are numbers out there that say that in the next several years, next 10 or 15 years, whatever, is going to be $100 trillion pass hands. You've seen that number, right? I've seen different numbers, but I've seen numbers as high as $125 trillion. But this has never happened in history. We've never had this kind of generational transfer of wealth ever. It is so much bigger than it has ever been that there will be consequences from that. And the consequences from that could be pretty bad because if that wealth is transmitted to people who aren't prepared to receive it, they don't have the skills. That Ohio State University says that they did a 2012 study that found it takes about 19 months for the average heir to get rid of an inheritance. Most of our clients didn't work and save to have the kids spend it 19 months, right? They wanted it to accomplish something different. Wealth can do harm. People don't really appreciate how much damage wealth can do, but wealth can also be an amazing benefit. It can create financial security they didn't have. I think marriages are better. They can get education they may not have gotten. They could travel to places in the world they may not have been able to go. You can really make a positive impact in people's lives by leaving wealth. So our job as planners is to be the guys between the money and the people receiving it, and then to take the tools that we have in our toolbox, all of which are not complicated, not hard to understand, but take those tools, hear the story, hear the client's story, and then assemble a plan using those tools that protect the wealth and transmit the values in ways that maximize the good that it can do and minimize the damage it can do. That's what we do. And I believe that this work that we do is a calling. And I'm telling you that at the end of every workday, when you do this, there's a feeling that you have that I've done good in the world. I've done things that made an impact in the world today. And I feel really blessed to have the opportunity to do this. And I'm thankful that that law partner of mine years ago sent that lady in to see me, and so I really, in a way, sort of stumbled into doing this, but it didn't take me but a minute to realize this is it. This is what I was built to do.
Dan, thank you for that, Stan. With all your success, Stan, what do you find now is your biggest challenge?
So my biggest challenge is convincing my wife that she doesn't want to live with a retiree. So it's the next chapter, right? It's like, okay, so I've done what I've done, but now what do I do? How do I think big about my life? How do I figure out what impact I can make in the world moving forward and have a plan for that? I have no plan to go play golf. I want to take everything that I've learned, including all the mistakes I've made, and use that as an asset to design my own personal future so that I can create a greater impact in the world. And that's my challenge, right? And so I think that's going to be the challenge up until the last day.
Thank you so much for that. Very interesting. Where can our audience go to learn more about you and your firm?
So firm you can find it at pinnaclelegacylaw.com. You can learn more about me. I have a personal website that tells some of the personal stuff about me. It's .co, stanmiller.co. I talk about some of the charitable projects that I'm currently involved in. Would like for people to go to that website and take a look, because some of the things I'm doing may be things that other people would want to be involved in the last couple of years, in helping buy trucks and actually drive those trucks from up to Northern Europe down to Ukraine. We've been buying trucks for soldiers, at least for now. We've handed the keys to over 500 trucks to soldiers that didn't have a vehicle to get around in the wintertime on the Ukrainian-Russian front. And that's been a project of mine. I've been contributing to that. I've been raising money from other people for that, rather shamelessly, I would say. And I've been driving the trucks. And it's introduced me to a whole new group of folks, patriots from Estonia and Finland and Poland and Ukraine. That's been an inspiration for me. We're involved in a study abroad project at my alma mater. We're sending kids off to other parts of the world to get a semester of education in a place that an opportunity I never had. I grew up on a farm and I never went anywhere, and I didn't realize what an impact it is to spend some time in another part of the world. And so we're now creating that opportunity in my alma mater, doing that. So these are fun things. And what's really exciting about it for me is that my son and his wife are also involved in those with me. So it's some of the charitable things we're doing are things that are involving my whole family, and it's created a new dimension in my relationship with them, because now we're not just getting together and having dinner. We're getting together around the table to figure out how do we better serve these students who many of whom are afraid to take a trip abroad because they don't speak the language. They've never been anywhere. We're having to strategize about how do we deal with that and help them become more open to the opportunity to experience a different culture. And so we're doing that. And so those are some of the things.
Well, Stan, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it. Very interesting. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
It's been a pleasure, Roger. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where we provide the info you need from successful leading financial advisors, lawyers, and CPAs. Your hosts, Roger and Catherine Silk, invite you to learn more about Sterling Foundation Management by visiting sterlingfoundations.com.